Kia ora, and welcome to episode 10 in the series of short videos on how we respond biblically in this time of COVID-19. And in this particular video, I want to talk about this biblical response of worry less. Worry less. Worry has always been an issue for the human race. As human beings, we've often struggled with this deep anxiety and concern and worry about the future and about life. A few years ago, one reporter in Time magazine wrote these words: "It's 4 a.m. and you're wide awake, palms sweaty, heart racing. You're worried about your kids, your aging parents, your retirement, your health." And that was true anyway, but those words really ring true now, don't they? She could have written this yesterday about living with COVID-19, because these are the things we're worried about right now. So what do we do with worry? Well, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus spoke directly to the struggle that so many of us have with worry. And 3 times in Matthew 6:25-34, Jesus gives the same command. Do not worry about your life. So do not worry. Do not worry about tomorrow. 3 times Jesus tells us in this little section to not worry. The difficulty is that when we're told not to worry, it often doesn't feel like it helps. Reminds me of the song that was released decades ago that you may already have thought of as you started to watch this. Here's the little song I wrote. You might want to sing it note for note. Don't worry, be happy. And you may want to hum that along to yourself. The truth of the matter is, though, you look through the lyrics of the song, as I just did a little while ago, and Bobby McFerrin doesn't actually tell us how to not worry and be happy. The whole song just simply says, don't worry, be happy. But it never tells us how. And for many people, they come to the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and hear Jesus say, do not worry, do not worry, do not worry. And everything in us screams, but how do I not worry? And the beautiful thing about Jesus is he doesn't just sing a beautiful song. He actually, in the Sermon on the Mount, tells us how. In this little section in Matthew 6:25-34. And I want to very quickly highlight 2 key things that Jesus tells us in our struggle with worry. First of all, Jesus says, reject worry by trusting in God's care. Reject worry by trusting that God cares for us. And Jesus discusses this or illustrates this a number of ways. First of all, in verse 26, he says, look at the birds of the air. They don't sow or reap or stow away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Jesus uses this beautiful example that resonates for everyone, wherever you live in the world. We can see birds flying around or nestled in trees, and Jesus says, look at them. They don't worry. And yet your Father feeds them. And what Jesus is doing is arguing from the lesser to the greater here. He's saying, if the Father cares for those little birds, don't you think he's going to care for you? Don't you think he loves you? And it's a rhetorical question. The implied answer to the question is absolutely yes. If he cares for the birds, of course he cares for us. But the problem is many of us don't believe that deep down in our guts. But that's what Jesus wants us to understand. We can reject worry by choosing to trust that our Father really does care deeply for us. And that can be maybe something that we need to remind ourselves of. Maybe you're not fully convinced of that. Jesus would say, go for a walk, look at the birds, and reflect on my words. The Father loves you and cares for you so much more deeply than them. And we are to reject worry by trusting that our Father cares deeply for us. Not only that, but in the next verse, verse 27, he asks another question. Can any of you by worrying add a single hour to your life? This is another question. The implied answer this time is no. Worry doesn't help us accomplish anything. We can't worry so hard about our life that we add even an extra hour onto our 70 years or whatever we live. We don't have that kind of power. Worry doesn't accomplish anything. Now, for years I thought this was simply a practical reason why we shouldn't worry. But as I've reflected on this in the last couple of days, I think Jesus is being, yes, practical, but theological as well. Worry doesn't add to our lifespan. In fact, if anything, doctors would tell us it can often lessen our lifespan, as worry and stress reduces our lives very often. But I think what Jesus is implying here is that while we don't have the power over our lives like that, there is one that does. Our Father not only cares deeply for us, but our Father is the one who controls our lives. David wrote in Psalm 139, "All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." And our Father not only cares deeply for us, our Father controls our lives. And then in verse 32, Jesus says, "Your heavenly Father knows you need these things." See, the Father knows exactly what we need. And if you're struggling right now, perhaps with your health in this time of virus, or your finances, maybe your business is threatening to go under, perhaps you've been made redundant, or you're concerned about your job, maybe you're worried about the health of your parents, the Father, Jesus says, knows exactly what you need. He knows. He knows what you need, He cares deeply about you, and He's fully in control. And in light of those three things, Jesus says, we can reject worry by choosing to trust in God's care for us. So reject worry, He says. He doesn't just sing, "Don't worry, be happy." He tells us, don't worry, and He calls us to reject worry by choosing to trust that God cares deeply for us, knows exactly what we need, and is fully in control. But then Jesus does something else towards the end of this passage. He also then tells us to replace worry. This is very similar to what Paul did in Philippians chapter 4, if you remember a few videos back, where Paul said, don't be anxious, instead pray. So the antidote to anxiety is prayer. I think Jesus is doing the same again. Don't worry, trust that God cares for you, and instead of worrying, do something else. And what it is that He calls us to do is to pursue God and His glory. He puts it this way in verse 33, "But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." Jesus has been talking about God's kingdom through the Sermon on the Mount. He calls earlier in chapter 6 for us to pray that God's kingdom would come and His will be done. He's talked about what it means to live according to the righteousness of God, that none of us can be perfect like God, but we can live the right kind of way. I would sum up what Jesus is saying by talking about pursuing God's glory. In fact, right before this passage, Jesus had talked about the fact that we can either store up treasure on earth or treasure in heaven, but we can't do both. We can't serve two masters. And what Jesus is saying is that we need to both reject worry by trusting God's goodness to us and His care, but we also need to replace worry by being more concerned about God's kingdom and God's agenda and God's name and God's glory. See, there's a little play here going on. In the previous verse, he talked about that the pagans run after these things, or strive after these things, or seek these things. These two words in verses 32 and 33 are from the same root word in the original Greek language. And so he's saying we should not strive after or seek these ordinary things of life that so often we worry about. Instead, we should seek God's kingdom, God's righteousness, God's glory. It's not that we should not be concerned about our business. It's not that we shouldn't work to make sure that it survives. It's not that we shouldn't look hard for a new job if we've been laid off, or be careful with our health or the health of others that we love. But we should not be pursuing or be eaten up by those things, because instead we should be pursuing the glory of God. That's how Jesus tells us to not worry, to trust in God's care and to pursue God's glory, to reject worry and then replace worry by being more eaten up, more concerned, more consumed by what we are doing for the glory of God than about the other things of life. Jesus tells us and invites us to worry less. I love the words of Corrie ten Boom, a beautiful Christian woman who's now passed away, who survived the Nazi concentration camps with a faith in God that was intact. She said these beautiful words, "Worry doesn't empty tomorrow of its sorrows, but it empties today of its strength." Friends, let's not empty today of the strength that we need. Instead, let's worry less. Let's reject worry by trusting that God really does care and He does know what we need and He is fully in control. And let's replace worry by being consumed and seeking after the glory of God. Let's pursue that and let's worry less.